Hey guys, I wanted to introduce you today to the idea of a narrative arc. All stories, whether it's the short stories like we'll be reading in this unit, or novels like what you will be reading later in the year, and any stories that you've already read in any language, usually follow what's called the narrative arc. This narrative arc is the way that stories play out. So all stories have these certain aspects to them. So stories will usually start with an introduction where we are introduced to the characters and the setting where the story is happening. After that, there is usually an inciting incident where some problem is introduced. All stories have to have a problem. Sometimes that's called a conflict. After that problem happens comes the rising action. This is when the characters try to solve that problem. But usually, in many stories, tension mounts until, as the characters are trying to solve this problem, the tension will mount until the story reaches the climax. The climax is usually thought of as the most exciting point in the story, and it can be, but it can also be more accurately termed as the point of no return, the point at which the characters can't go back to the way things were. Someone has to make a decision, and it's going to change things for all of the characters. Once that decision has been made comes the falling action. This is when the consequences of the decision that was made during the climactic section of the story are sort of played out, and we see what happens as a result of that and how do the characters change. And then finally comes the resolution where we see the end of the story and we understand how the characters have changed. And you'll see here called the transformation, which this is when the characters are changing in the story. So this narrative arc describes the plot or the events of all stories. So let's take an example of this so we can see this with a real story. Let's take the fairy tale Cinderella. If we look at that fairy tale, we can see that in the introduction, we learn that Cinderella's father has died. She has a stepmother who is not kind to her and makes her clean the house all the time. And she has two stepsisters who are also very mean to her. The inciting incident is when the prince announces that he will have a ball to choose a wife. This is the inciting incident because it begins the character change. So Cinderella wants to go to the ball, and her stepmother tells her she can if she finishes all her work. So the rising action comes when she tries to finish all of her work, but she can't. And she's very sad, and she thinks she can't go to the ball, but then she gets a visit from her fairy godmother. Her fairy godmother then gives her a beautiful ball gown so that she can go to the ball, and she gives her glass slippers. So Cinderella goes to the ball, knowing that she has to be back by midnight or the spell will be broken. So she goes to the ball, she meets the prince, she and the prince fall in love, but it turns out that time got away from Cinderella and it's midnight. So she has to run away. This is the climax of the fairy tale. She has to run away because she doesn't want the prince to know that she's really a servant. So she runs away and the prince can't find her. That's the climax. The falling action of the story is when the prince tries to find Cinderella. So he sends out people to take the glass slipper that she left behind and try it on all of the women in his kingdom to find the mystery woman, Cinderella. And so they go out and try to find this mystery woman, and they get to Cinderella's house, and the stepmother tries to stop them from being able to find Cinderella, but she is able to use the help of her mice and her birds and her little animal friends, and she is able to meet the prince, and the resolution is they get married and they live happily ever after. So you can see that that's the story of the fairy tales, and you will be able to put any story that you read into this narrative arc.